for a guy who only weighed 138 pounds, and he weighed less than that when he passed away. He hit extremely hard. He could hit as hard as a heavyweight.
What happens when two of the greatest martial artists in history step into the ring together? A clash so intense that it leaves one of them questioning everything they thought they knew about fighting. Joe Louis, a dominant force in the world of karate, finally reveals what happened when he faced off against Bruce Lee.
I know that's because he stood in front of me and he popped me a few times. So I've always told people, I know how hard Bruce Lee could hit. I know how fast he was because he nailed me. And I've always told people, I know what real Jeet Kune Do was because I got popped with it a few times.
The man who revolutionized martial arts forever. The truth behind their encounter is more shocking than anyone ever imagined, and fans are left stunned by Louis's confession. The legend and the challenger. The world of martial arts has witnessed many warriors, but few names command the same level of reverence as Bruce Lee and Joe Louis. These two men were not just fighters, they were pioneers who reshaped the landscape of combat sports, elevating martial arts from a traditional discipline into an evolving science of movement, speed, and power. Bruce Lee, the enigmatic master of Jeet Kune Do, was a visionary who sought to break the shackles of rigid tradition. He was not content with adhering to outdated methods. His mind was constantly probing, questioning, and redefining what it meant to fight. For Lee, combat was an ever-evolving dialogue where adaptation was key, and any limitation imposed by traditional styles was a weakness. His philosophy of fighting rejected the notion of style altogether, proclaiming instead that efficiency and fluidity should dictate a warrior's approach. His ability to merge power, precision, and intellectual foresight into combat was unprecedented. On the other hand, Joe Louis was a juggernaut of American karate, a fearsome competitor with an unshakable reputation in full-contact fighting. Unlike Lee, Louis thrived in the structured realm of traditional martial arts, where discipline and power were paramount. His record spoke for itself. As a multiple-time heavyweight karate champion, Louis dominated his opponents with brute force, precise strikes, and an unrelenting fighting spirit. He had trained under some of the most revered instructors in the world, including the legendary Okinawan master, Seikichi Odo. Yet, despite his traditional karate roots, Louis was always in search of an edge, something that would push him beyond his already formidable skills and make him truly unstoppable in the ring. Their paths were destined to cross. For years, whispers of their encounter have circulated in martial arts circles. It was no secret that Lee and Louis trained together, but what transpired behind closed doors remained one of the great unsolved mysteries of martial arts lore. Some claim that Louis, a reigning champion of full-contact fighting, walked into Lee's domain expecting a training session, only to be left stunned by what followed. Others speculated that it was an outright challenge, a meeting of two warriors testing their skills against one another. For decades, fans have speculated about what really happened when these two titans clashed in the privacy of a training facility. There were rumors, exaggerations, and conflicting stories. Some believed Louis had held his own, while others whispered of a humiliating defeat that changed his outlook on combat forever. But until now, the truth remained elusive. Finally, Joe Louis has broken his silence, peeling back the layers of myth and revealing the details of what happened when he stood face-to-face with Bruce Lee in a test of skill, speed, and sheer combat ability.
Especially his speed. I always thought he was like the fastest guy who ever stood in front of me.
His revelations have sent shockwaves through the martial arts community, leaving fans in absolute disbelief. Bruce Lee was far more than just a martial artist. He was a philosopher, a revolutionary, and a relentless seeker of truth. His approach to combat was deeply intellectual. He didn't just fight, he dissected movement, studied human mechanics, and sought the most effective way to overcome an opponent. His creation, Jeet Kune Do, was not a rigid martial art, but a philosophy that emphasized adaptability, speed, and raw efficiency in combat. Lee's movements were like poetry in motion, flawless, unpredictable, and devastatingly precise. His speed was so blinding that even experienced fighters struggled to track his strikes. His famous one-inch punch could send a man flying across the room with seemingly minimal effort. But beyond his physical abilities, his mind was perhaps his deadliest weapon. He understood fighting not as a set of techniques, but as a dynamic conversation where the opponent's every move could be countered with devastating effectiveness. On the opposite end of the spectrum stood Joe Louis, an absolute powerhouse of American karate. Unlike many traditional martial artists of his time, Louis was a fighter in every sense of the word. He wasn't interested in flashy techniques or philosophical musings. He was a warrior who thrived in the heat of competition. His reputation was built on the bones of his opponents. He had fought and defeated some of the best fighters in the world, using a combination of raw strength, calculated aggression, and precise striking. Louis wasn't just powerful. He was an intelligent fighter who knew how to read his adversary, adapt to their weaknesses, and deliver crushing blows that ended fights in seconds. His name carried an air of dominance, and few dared to challenge him. But despite his impressive resume, nothing had prepared him for what awaited in his encounter with Bruce Lee. He had faced many powerful adversaries in his career, but none had ever truly outclassed him. That is, until he crossed paths with Bruce Lee. The moment their encounter began, Louis immediately realized that he was dealing with something entirely different. Lee's movements were impossibly fast, blindingly so. Before Louis could even register what was happening, Lee's strikes were already in motion, landing with pinpoint accuracy and force. Louis would later describe it as a humbling experience, one that made him question everything he thought he knew about speed, efficiency, and combat. The impact of their encounter left him in awe, forever altering his approach to martial arts. As Joe Louis recounts the brutal experience, his words paint a vivid picture of the encounter, one that has left martial arts enthusiasts in absolute shock. It was not just a fight, it was a revelation. A glimpse into the mind of a master who saw combat in a way that few could ever hope to understand. And for Joe Louis, it was an experience he would never forget. The Long Beach Tournament Revelation. It was the fateful 1967 Long Beach International Karate Championships that forever altered Joe Louis's perception of martial arts. At the time, Louis was already a dominant force in full-contact karate, a powerhouse known for his unmatched strength and strategic precision. He had fought and bested some of the greatest fighters of his era, earning his reputation as an unstoppable force in the ring. But what he witnessed at Long Beach would redefine everything he thought he knew about combat. Among the many competitors and demonstrations, one man stood out, not because of his size, but because of his presence: Bruce Lee. At this point, Lee was not yet the global martial arts icon he would become. But his reputation had already begun to spread like wildfire among martial artists. Joe Louis, ever the critical observer, watched closely as Lee stepped forward to perform a demonstration. What he saw shook him to his core. "For a while, I was able to get that punch in on Bruce Lee," Louis would later admit, "but then he would go into that little Zen alpha state, and I couldn't get anything in." The sparring session that followed wasn't just a friendly exchange of techniques. It was a collision of two warriors at the peak of their abilities. A battle of skill, speed, and raw instinct. Joe Louis versus Bruce Lee. At first, Louis believed he had an edge. His size, power, and formal karate training gave him a sense of control. He relied on his traditional fighting stance, maintaining distance and preparing to strike at the perfect moment. But Bruce Lee had a completely different approach. He was not bound by rigid stances or conventional methods. Instead, he moved with an eerie fluidity, unpredictable, elusive, and devastatingly efficient. The fight began. Louis barely had time to react before the first blindingly fast jab landed. It was like a blur, a movement so quick that it felt almost invisible. Before Louis even registered the impact, another strike followed, a rapid-fire succession of punches that found their mark with pinpoint accuracy. Instinctively, Louis retaliated with a powerful roundhouse kick, one of his signature moves. Any other fighter would have taken the hit, but not Bruce Lee. He sidestepped effortlessly, dodging as if he had seen the kick coming before it was even thrown. In a flash, he countered with a combination that struck Lewis in the ribs, each hit timed so perfectly that Lewis found himself gasping for breath. For the first time in his career, Joe Louis realized that sheer strength wasn't enough. Bruce Lee was beyond fast. He was something else entirely, something Lewis had never encountered before. Lewis would later reflect on one of Bruce Lee's deadliest techniques, the speed punch. He had heard rumors about it, but nothing could prepare him for the real thing. "Now watch this little trick here," Lewis once said while attempting to replicate the move. He demonstrated it to an eager audience, challenging fellow black belts to block it. But no matter how fast they reacted, Lee had always been faster. This speed punch wasn't just a random flurry of movement. It was a precisely calculated, biomechanically optimized strike, executed in a way that defied traditional martial arts logic. Lewis described the mechanics, the subtle weight shifts, the perfect extension of the arm. Yet, even understanding its components, achieving Bruce Lee's level of velocity seemed impossible. Fans who witnessed this revelation were left speechless. During their fight, Lee used this very punch against Lewis multiple times. Each time, the impact sent a shock through Lewis's body. He wasn't just being struck, he was being overwhelmed. It was a demonstration of absolute control. The worst part? Bruce Lee was holding back. Lewis would later admit that if Lee had fought at full force, I might not have walked away from that fight unscathed. The Long Beach tournament was meant to showcase the best fighters in the world. But for Joe Louis, it became something more. A turning point. A moment when he realized that martial arts had reached a new era, and Bruce Lee was the man leading the charge. The breaking point. As the fight wore on, Joe Louis found himself in uncharted territory. He was no stranger to tough opponents. He had faced and bested some of the most formidable fighters in the martial arts world. But this was different. This was Bruce Lee. From the moment they engaged, Louis sensed something was off. Not with Lee, but with himself. He wasn't used to feeling this slow. His reflexes, which had always been razor sharp, felt sluggish compared to Lee's inhuman speed. His techniques, honed through years of disciplined training, were being picked apart with an almost surgical precision. It was as if Lee was not just reacting to his moves, but predicting them before they even happened. "He nearly killed me," Louis later admitted, his voice tinged with a mix of awe and disbelief. He recalled a moment when Lee's strikes landed so quickly, so precisely, that he could barely suck in air. A devastating series of blows had left him momentarily stunned, his vision blurred, his breath caught in his chest. He had never felt such raw power condensed into such small, explosive movements. And yet Lee wasn't even fighting with full force. That realization was the most terrifying part. Every move Louis attempted, every carefully calculated kick, every counterstrike, every attempt to regain control, was met with immediate and devastating precision. His traditional karate blocks, which had served him well against countless competitors, seemed to move in slow motion against Lee's rapid-fire assaults. There was no wasted motion in Lee's strikes, no hesitation. He was simply operating on a different plane, a level of martial artistry that defied everything Louis had encountered before. Then came the moment of truth. Frustration mounting, Louis made a split-second decision. He could not afford to hold back. If finesse and technique weren't enough, then he would overwhelm Lee with raw power and unrelenting aggression. He surged forward, unleashing a relentless barrage of strikes, hoping to force Lee onto the defensive. If he could just break through the storm, maybe, just maybe, he could regain some control. But it was a mistake. In that instant, Lee saw everything: the intent, the desperation, the overextension. And he acted. With a sudden, fluid motion, Lee pivoted on his heel and unleashed a devastating spinning back kick that landed with the force of a battering ram. The impact struck Louis square in the midsection, knocking the wind out of him and sending him stumbling backward. Before he could recover, Lee was already in motion, closing the distance like a phantom. A lightning-fast sequence of strikes followed, each one perfectly placed, each one a message that could not be ignored. Louis barely had time to process what was happening before he found himself completely at Lee's mercy. And in that fleeting moment, a chilling thought crossed his mind. If this had been a real fight, he wouldn't be standing. He wouldn't even be conscious. It was then that Joe Louis fully understood what he was up against. Bruce Lee wasn't just a martial artist. He wasn't just another skilled fighter. He was something else entirely, something beyond technique, beyond speed, beyond strength. He was a force of nature, lessons from the dragon. Despite the sheer intensity of their battle, Louis walked away with more than just bruises. He left with invaluable lessons that would shape his understanding of martial arts forever. His reflections on that fight offer a rare glimpse into the mind of a warrior, humbled by the sheer genius of Bruce Lee's approach to combat. The interview he released 5 years after that fight, in 1972, went lost for years until it recently resurfaced online. Many people expected heated comments from Louis, perhaps some animosity, but instead witnessed a master in martial arts pay a humble, heartfelt homage to a man who simply transcended labels. Louis immediately commented that he learnt a lot from Mr. Bruce Lee, as he called his friend and colleague. His first lesson? In order to start a fight, a man only needs technique and guts. But in order to finish it, that man needs heart. And no one had more heart than Bruce Lee when he stepped on the ring. One of the key takeaways for Louis was the importance of modifying traditional blocks. Instead of utilizing the traditional block, which is moving with the elbow, just move this part of your arm from your elbow to your fist, he explains, showcasing a seemingly simple yet revolutionary adjustment in defensive tactics. It was a fundamental shift in how martial artists perceived blocking. A technique that had been ingrained in centuries of practice was suddenly being challenged and refined by Lee's lightning-fast adaptive approach. Lee's method wasn't just about reacting, it was about minimizing wasted movement, increasing efficiency, and maintaining an offensive advantage while staying defensive. For Louis, this revelation was more than a mere technical adjustment. It was a profound insight into Lee's overall philosophy of combat. Lee had an almost scientific approach to martial arts, treating every movement as a calculated formula, each action streamlined for maximum impact. The fans who heard Louis recount this moment were left in awe, realizing just how deeply Bruce Lee's philosophy had influenced even the greatest martial artists of the time. Lee wasn't just fast. He was strategic, cerebral, and constantly innovating, even in the midst of battle. Despite the brutal fight, there was no animosity between Louis and Lee. If anything, it only deepened Louis's admiration for his opponent. While most fighters might have held onto pride or sought a rematch to reclaim their dominance, Louis instead chose to learn. He openly spoke about how Bruce Lee's unique training methods, mental discipline, and otherworldly speed changed his entire outlook on martial arts. But it wasn't just about technique, it was about mentality. Lee's philosophy extended far beyond physical prowess. It was a mindset, a way of life. He preached adaptability, urging fighters to be like water, to flow effortlessly, to take shape according to the opponent's movements, and to strike with unpredictable precision. Louis saw firsthand how this philosophy translated into real combat, where Bruce's movements felt almost supernatural. Over time, the two warriors forged a deep mutual respect. Despite being one of the most dominant fighters in the world, Louis never hesitated to admit that Bruce Lee was something beyond extraordinary. He wasn't just quick, Louis would later say. He was precise. Every movement had a purpose. Every strike had intent. There was no wasted energy. When Louis's story resurfaced, the martial arts community was sent into a frenzy. Many fans of both fighters had long speculated about Bruce's legendary speed and precision, but hearing a first-hand account from a world champion like Joe Louis gave his prowess an undeniable sense of authenticity. Online forums, social media platforms, and martial arts discussion boards became battlegrounds of passionate analysis. Enthusiasts meticulously dissected every word Louis uttered, scrutinizing the nuances of his descriptions and comparing them to the sparse footage available of Bruce Lee in action. The overwhelming consensus? Bruce Lee was not just a martial artist, he was a phenomenon. "This is some rare stuff," one fan commented, capturing the excitement that rippled across the internet. Many were in disbelief that such a monumental story had remained relatively obscure for so long. Others debated whether any modern fighter could ever match the sheer explosiveness that Lewis described. For die-hard martial arts historians, Lewis's testimony became an instant classic, an invaluable piece of evidence supporting the idea that Bruce Lee was operating on an entirely different level from his contemporaries. His unmatched speed, precision, and strategy were no longer just the stuff of legend. They were now being validated by a fighter who had faced some of the toughest opponents of his era. And perhaps the most striking takeaway from the story, Joe Louis himself, a dominant force in his own right, openly admitted that Bruce Lee's abilities left him stunned. If a fighter of Lewis's caliber could be left in shock, what did that say about Bruce Lee's untapped potential? The legacy of a fight. The story of Joe Louis and Bruce Lee's brutal encounter is more than just a tale of two elite fighters. It is a defining moment that underscores the revolutionary genius of Bruce Lee. Their clash wasn't just an ordinary sparring session. It was an encounter that would shape the perception of martial arts for generations. Joe Louis, a world champion in full-contact karate and one of the most feared fighters of his era, had already proven himself in the ring. With his unmatched power, strategic mind, and relentless aggression, Louis was considered nearly unbeatable. But when he faced Bruce Lee, he encountered something he had never experienced before, a level of speed, precision, and adaptability that defied everything he had come to know about combat. In recounting that fateful encounter, Louis confirmed what fans had long believed. Bruce Lee was in a league of his own. His unparalleled speed allowed him to strike before Louis could even register a reaction. His techniques were so fluid, so effortless, that it was as if he could predict his opponent's every move before it happened. Most astonishingly, his philosophy of martial arts, his concept of being formless, adapting like water, was not just theoretical, it was real, and Joe Louis experienced it firsthand. Even as a seasoned champion, he admitted that he struggled to counter Bruce's movements, acknowledging that Lee had an almost supernatural ability to read and respond to his opponents. The impact of that fight extended far beyond Joe Louis. Martial artists around the world continue to analyze Bruce Lee's methods, striving to replicate the speed, precision, and versatility that made him a legend. Even now, in an era dominated by modern mixed martial arts, fighters seek to reach the level of mastery that Bruce Lee demonstrated so effortlessly. Joe Louis never forgot the lessons he learned that day, and neither has the martial arts world. His revelation about Bruce Lee's dominance only fueled the legend of a man who transcended fighting itself. Decades after his passing, Bruce Lee's influence remains as powerful as ever. His legacy is not just one of skill, but of revolution, of breaking boundaries, challenging limitations, and proving that martial arts is not just about combat, but about self-expression, adaptability, and the pursuit of human potential. Fans remain blown away by Joe Louis's confession, and one undeniable truth echoes through time. Bruce Lee wasn't just a fighter, he was a phenomenon. If you had the chance to step into the ring with Bruce Lee, how do you think you would fare? Let us know in the comments below, and thank you for listening. Join us in the next video.